On March 18, 1945, in an Allied field hospital operating near the Rhine River in western Germany, medical staff recorded another critical casualty. According to wartime medical logs from U.S. Army field hospitals active during the final Allied push into Germany, patients arriving from the front often passed through multiple aid stations before reaching full treatment facilities. Each transfer increased survival chances. Each also increased infection risk. This soldier had been moved twice. It saved his life. Then it began to cost it. By the time he arrived, his wounds were heavily contaminated. Tissue had begun to fail. Fever had settled deep into his body. Shortly after sunrise, the attending surgeon reviewed the chart. In frontline hospitals, doctors were trained to make rapid decisions under pressure. Medical manuals from 1944 and 1945 emphasized triage efficiency over prolonged intervention. When resources were limited, attention shifted to patients with higher survival probability. One standard entry, consistent with surviving records, read, "Condition deteriorating, extensive infection, no further operative options available." It was not simply a medical judgment. It was a system judgment. By early 1945, antibiotics and plasma were still rationed under Army Medical Department directives. Supplies followed priority lists, not individual stories. During major offensives like the Rhine crossing, shortages were routine. Every bed was a calculation. Every dose was a choice. Every delay affected someone else. By mid-morning, the soldier's temperature rose past 104 degrees. Nurses' notes from this period describe heavy sweating, shallow breathing, and confusion, classic signs of systemic infection in pre-modern intensive care conditions. A typical entry read, "Non-responsive, prognosis poor." At this point, the medical system began to withdraw, not because the doctors stopped caring, because the structure required them to. Field hospitals were designed for turnover, not long-term recovery. They existed to stabilize and move on. When stabilization failed, policy dictated disengagement. By late afternoon, the register reflected that reality. Terminal, comfort measures only. This phrase appears repeatedly in surviving wartime records. It was medicine's version of surrender. No more antibiotics, no more procedures, no more escalation. Once written, it shifted responsibility away from individuals and onto protocol. The decision was reviewed, signed, and archived. The burden was redistributed. Under Geneva Convention guidelines, German prisoners of war were sometimes assigned to non-sensitive hospital roles. Officially, this was a logistical measure. Unofficially, it placed former enemies inside the most vulnerable spaces of war. One such worker, identified only as Anna K. in administrative lists, had trained in civilian hospitals before the war. After her capture in late 1944, she was transferred into auxiliary service. She was not authorized to diagnose, not permitted to prescribe, not allowed to question decisions. Her role was obedience. Nursing logs from similar facilities show POW auxiliaries assisting with cleaning, bedding, and repositioning patients. They existed inside the system, but outside its authority. That afternoon, she was working in Ward C. She watched the charts close. She saw supplies redirected. She noticed how attention moved elsewhere. According to policy, the soldier was expected to die within 48 hours. From the system's perspective, the case was resolved. From a human perspective, it was unfinished. This is where the story shifts, because what followed was not about medical innovation. It was about institutional pressure. It was about what happens when protocol becomes more powerful than perception. The doctors were not villains. They were operating inside constraints created by war. Anna was not a hero in uniform. She was a woman placed at the edge of authority. Between them stood a dying man, and a decision that no regulation could fully answer. In that space, between policy and conscience, between efficiency and empathy, the outcome had not yet been decided. Not by medicine, not by command, not by history, yet. On March 19, 1945, less than a day after a terminal classification was entered in the register, staff at an Allied field hospital near the Rhine began to notice something unexpected. Wartime nursing logs from similar units show that night shift staff routinely recorded subtle changes in patient condition. In this case, one such entry reflected measurable improvement. Temperature reduced, breathing steadier, patient responsive to voice. Under mid-1940s medical expectations, this was unusual. Advanced infection in field conditions was typically progressive. Once a patient reached comfort-only status, survival rates dropped sharply. Manuals emphasized efficient triage, not prolonged reversal. Earlier that evening, routine observations had still reflected decline. Condition unchanged, weak pulse, shallow respiration. Supply records from the final months of the war show strict antibiotic control. Comfort-designated wards were not normally allocated additional medication. No new treatment was recorded. Administratively, nothing had changed. Medically, something had. As the night continued, the pattern shifted. Fever continues to drop. Improved responsiveness, pulse stronger than previous day. These were incremental observations. Not dramatic, not miraculous, but inconsistent with the prognosis. This contradiction is where the story deepens, because wartime field hospitals were designed for throughput, not anomaly investigation. When casualty numbers surged during major offensives, protocols prioritized momentum. Once a case was closed administratively, reopening it required attention that the system often could not spare. The structure discouraged reconsideration, not out of cruelty, out of efficiency. The terminal classification remained in the register. No amendment was made. Yet bedside notes reflected stabilization. Two realities now existed, the official record and the observable body. Staff noticed the gap. Some assumed the initial prognosis had been overly cautious. Others believed fever cycles could break unpredictably. A few quietly suspected undocumented intervention. No formal inquiry appears in records from comparable facilities. That absence is significant. In wartime institutions, unexplained improvement could be more destabilizing than expected death. A system built on measurable allocation does not easily accommodate variables it cannot trace. When a patient improves without authorized treatment, questions follow. Who intervened? Was protocol violated? Were scarce resources redirected without approval? In highly regulated medical environments, survival itself can become suspicious. During rounds on March 20th, a junior officer noted that the improvement did not align with the prior prognosis. Such marginal comments appear in surviving wartime reports, often without further action. And that silence reveals something larger. The system was built to make decisions under pressure. It was not built to examine doubt. This moment is not simply about medical uncertainty. It is about institutional inertia. When the body refused to follow the paperwork did not immediately adjust. Instead, it held its position. The hospital continued operating. Casualties arrived, priorities shifted. Yet in one bed, a patient who had been administratively written off was no longer declining. And that raises the question that moves this story forward. If the system did not change, what did? Because when improvement occurs without authorization, someone is acting outside the visible structure. And in a wartime hospital, that is never a small thing. Allied administrative records and post-war studies show that German prisoners of war were sometimes assigned to supervised labor inside field hospitals during 1944 and 1945. Under the Geneva Convention and Allied policy, this was legally permitted. It solved an immediate logistical problem, understaffed medical units overwhelmed by casualties. But it also created a structural contradiction. Captured personnel were close enough to suffering to witness it, yet excluded from authority over it. Auxiliary rosters from this period often reduced individuals to a single line, POW medical support. No background, no credentials, no voice. This was not an accident. Wartime bureaucracies deliberately minimized personal identity. It simplified management. It reduced legal risk. It reinforced hierarchy, but it also erased experience. Civilian nursing programs in Germany before the war were rigorous. Many women assigned to auxiliary service had been trained to recognize infection patterns, wound deterioration, and early signs of recovery. That knowledge did not disappear when they were captured. It was simply rendered unusable. Inside Allied hospitals, supervisory rules were explicit. Detainees were prohibited from diagnosing, prescribing, or intervening. Inspection reports from 1944 and 1945 repeatedly warn against unsupervised medical activity. The boundary was enforced because the system feared disorder more than it valued initiative. Unauthorized action threatened control. In high-pressure environments, control is survival. Ward assignments reflected that logic. Critical patients were grouped, rotated, and prioritized according to triage algorithms designed for speed, not nuance. Once a patient was classified as terminal, institutional attention shifted away. Reconsideration required paperwork. Paperwork required time. Time was scarce. For someone like Anna, this created an ethical trap. She possessed medical literacy. She recognized bodily changes. She understood what improvement looked like. Yet any attempt to act on that knowledge would have violated regulations and confirmed suspicions about POW interference. Silence was safer than intervention. Obedience was safer than compassion. And the system rewarded safety. In official documentation, auxiliaries like her remain nearly invisible. They appear as labor units, not moral agents. But memoirs and interviews from Allied staff suggest a more complicated reality. POW workers often noticed problems and improvements before authorized personnel did. They were close enough to see, too powerless to matter. This is the identity reversal at the center of the story. Before the war, Anna's training granted her authority. During the war, her status removed it. Competence became irrelevant. Classification became everything. The broader implication is uncomfortable. Wartime systems do not evaluate people by skill. They evaluate them by category: enemy, prisoner, auxiliary, authorized, unauthorized. Those labels decide who is allowed to help and who is not. As the soldier's condition began to shift, Anna stood at the intersection of two realities. She understood what was happening, and she was structurally prevented from responding. What follows is not simply a story of personal courage. It is a story about what happens when human capability is trapped inside institutional boundaries. When survival depends not only on knowledge, but on permission. And when the person best positioned to see the truth is the one least allowed to speak. Military personnel records and post-war studies show that many wounded soldiers hospitalized in early 1945 had been in near-continuous combat since late 1944. They arrived exhausted, physically depleted, mentally worn down, carrying months of unbroken pressure. The push toward the Rhine demanded speed and endurance. Units advanced through ruined towns and unstable front lines with little opportunity to recover. Rest was a luxury. Reflection was postponed. For most soldiers, survival meant staying focused on the next objective, not the next year. Yet even inside that system, personal lives persisted. Enlistment records show that many of these men had joined in 1943 as teenagers. Within 2 years, they had crossed oceans, survived multiple campaigns, and watched friends disappear. Hospital intake procedures reduced their possessions to short lists: wallet, letters, photograph. These inventories were practical. They prevented theft and confusion, but they also flattened identity. A person's history became a few objects in an envelope. Wartime letters from families often spoke about ordinary things: ration lines, factory shifts, gardens, canceled dances. They were not trivial. They were anchors. They reminded soldiers that another world still existed beyond the front. When patients asked to keep letters near their beds, it was not sentimentality. It was survival. Those pages connected them to who they had been before uniforms and serial numbers replaced names. Post-war interviews show that wounded soldiers frequently spoke about future plans while lying in hospital beds. Construction jobs, small businesses, farming, marriage. These conversations were psychological defenses. They pushed the mind forward when the body was failing. In institutional terms, however, hospitals were designed to manage bodies, not dreams. Red Cross workers helped patients write final messages because the system recognized the emotional need, but only within controlled limits. Letters from terminal patients were often held until status reviews, not out of cruelty, but out of administrative caution. Hope was regulated. When a terminal classification was entered, belongings were locked away, cataloged, filed, set aside. The procedure was orderly. The implication was not. It quietly assumed the future was closed. This is where the moral tension emerges. The system had to prepare for death. Families needed records. Units needed accountability. Hospitals needed turnover. But every administrative step toward closure also pulled against the possibility of survival. The more complete the paperwork became, the harder reversal would be. In this story, the soldiers' unopened letters and unsent message are not just sentimental details. They represent suspended identity. A life paused between two bureaucratic outcomes, recovered or recorded, nothing in between. Every patient was also a son, a friend, a future worker, a future husband, a future father. Those futures did not disappear when files were stamped. They were simply placed in storage, waiting. And what happens next will decide whether those sealed envelopes become relics or invitations back to life. By March 1945, Allied field hospitals in Western Germany were operating under extreme strain. Casualty numbers surged after the Rhine crossing. Medical units were forced to absorb the human cost of rapid territorial advance with limited infrastructure and shrinking supplies. This created a permanent state of crisis. Beds were never enough. Staff were never sufficient. Medicine was never plentiful. Every shortage fed the next. Army Medical Department directives attempted to impose order on that chaos. Antibiotics and plasma were rationed according to recovery probability. Triage manuals categorized patients by expected outcome. On paper, this was rational. In practice, it was brutal. The system was designed to maximize aggregate survival, not individual possibility. It treated medicine as a logistical asset, not a moral obligation. When resources are finite, compassion becomes conditional. Daily casualty and supply reports reduced human suffering to columns of numbers. Those numbers determined future deliveries. They also shaped medical decisions long before doctors reached the bedside. What looked like professional judgment was often pre-decided by scarcity. Staffing policies deepened the problem. Experienced personnel were pushed forward with advancing units. Less prepared replacements filled the gaps. Long shifts normalized exhaustion. Fatigue narrowed empathy. Under those conditions, triage categories became psychological shields. Expectant was not just a medical term. It was permission to disengage. Once a patient entered that category, responsibility shifted away from individual caregivers and into institutional procedure. Reversal required paperwork, approval, and time, three things the system rarely had. Inspection memoranda, warning against unauthorized antibiotic use, were not merely technical instructions. They reflected a deeper fear: loss of control. In wartime medicine, control equals survival. Supplies, personnel, and outcomes must be predictable. Unapproved intervention introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty threatens command. Performance evaluations reinforced this logic. Hospitals were judged by throughput and efficiency. Success meant moving patients quickly, either forward or out of the system. Prolonged care was framed as resource waste, not because lives were unimportant, because lives had to be prioritized. Doctors were trained to save whoever they could. The system trained them to save only those who fit statistical models. Individual conscience collided with institutional necessity. Within this structure, classifying the soldier as expectant was not negligence. It was obedience. It followed doctrine, it preserved resources, it protected careers, and that is precisely what makes it disturbing. No one had to act cruelly for the outcome to become cruel. No one had to be malicious for hope to be withdrawn. The system did it quietly, rationally, legally. When survival becomes a calculation, mercy becomes an exception. And when that happens, the most dangerous force in medicine is no longer disease. It is efficiency. What happens next will show what occurs when one person steps outside that calculation. By March 20, 1945, Allied field hospitals near the Rhine were operating inside rigid routines shaped by scarcity, speed, and command pressure. Medical manuals defined what could be done. Supply reports defined what was available. Performance metrics defined what was rewarded. Together, they created a narrow corridor for decision-making. Once a patient was classified as expectant, that corridor became even narrower. Official doctrine required authorization for reclassification. In theory, this protected resources. In practice, it delayed moral judgment behind administrative procedure. The soldier in Ward C existed inside that delay. Bedside notes reflected improvement. Official status did not. This contradiction reveals the central tension of wartime medicine. Doctors and nurses could see what was happening, but they were trained not to trust what they saw unless paperwork confirmed it. Under heavy intake conditions, physicians were responsible for dozens of critical patients. Each minute spent reconsidering one case was a minute not spent on another. Attention became a scarce resource, so hesitation became policy. The result was institutional inertia. Not because individuals were indifferent, because the structure punished deviation. POW auxiliaries like Anna were trapped even more tightly. They had no authority, no legal protection, no right to intervene. Inspection reports show that unauthorized action could lead to discipline or removal. For detainees, consequences were harsher and less predictable. Silence was safer than compassion. In this environment, moral responsibility was fragmented. Doctors deferred to protocol, nurses deferred to orders, auxiliaries deferred to survival. No single person owned the outcome. That diffusion of responsibility is how systems neutralize conscience. When improvement occurred without authorization, it created institutional anxiety. Was someone intervening? Were resources being misused? Was control weakening? Instead of prompting investigation, such questions were often avoided. Because investigation threatened stability, and stability mattered more than anomaly. Not by cruelty, by design. Efficiency replaces curiosity. Procedure replaces perception. Compliance replaces courage. The soldier's body was signaling recovery. The system was signaling closure. Between those signals stood individuals forced to choose which language to speak. Medical reality, or institutional safety. What happens next depends on who is willing to break that silence, and who is willing to accept the consequences. Between March 23rd and March 24th, 1945, the soldiers' slow improvement exposed a growing fault line inside the hospital system. On paper, nothing had changed. In the body, everything was changing. This period matters because it reveals how wartime institutions respond when reality begins to contradict policy. The hospital continued to document his condition. Nurses recorded temperature, alertness, wound appearance, and appetite. The system did not ignore him. It simply refused to reinterpret him. Under Army Medical Department doctrine, reclassification required formal review. That review demanded time, attention, and administrative justification. During high-casualty operations, all three were scarce, so incremental improvement became background noise, not important enough to interrupt the flow. Daily reports continued up the chain, emphasizing shortages and intake pressure. New wounded arrived constantly. Beds were reassigned, supplies were redirected. In that environment, a recovering expectant patient created a problem. If he was improving, someone had misjudged him. If someone had misjudged him, responsibility followed. Responsibility meant paperwork. Paperwork meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant risk. It was safer for the system to wait. The nurse's marginal note on March 24th, improvement sustained, recommend review, represents a quiet act of resistance. It was an attempt to force the system to look again. The physician's response, continue observation, status unchanged, reflects institutional caution, not cruelty. Risk management. Reopening a closed case meant questioning previous decisions. It meant reallocating scarce resources. It meant justifying why this patient deserved another chance over dozens of others. That is the moral dilemma embedded in triage. Every life saved implies another life deprioritized. As days passed, the evidence accumulated. Cleaner wounds, stable temperatures, clear speech, improved appetite. Each sign challenged the original prognosis, yet none were strong enough alone to override procedure. The system required certainty. Recovery arrives gradually. That mismatch favored bureaucracy. POW auxiliaries like Anna observed the same changes, but they were structurally excluded from influence. Their proximity to patients did not translate into authority. They could witness evidence. They could not present it. In wartime medicine, facts do not speak for themselves. They wait to be authorized, and sometimes, by the time permission arrives, opportunity has passed. Here, improvement persisted long enough to force attention. But for days, survival depended not on medicine alone. It depended on whether incremental truth could overcome institutional inertia, whether evidence could outweigh efficiency, whether a system designed for speed could slow down long enough to see what was happening in front of it. What comes next will determine whether that evidence is finally allowed to matter. March 25, 1945 represents more than a routine inspection. It marks the moment when institutional certainty finally began to crack. For days, the hospital had documented improvement without acting on it. Nurses recorded stability, wounds looked cleaner, breathing steadied, appetite returned. Yet the system held its position, because changing course in a wartime hospital was never a neutral act. It meant admitting that the original calculation might have been wrong. And in highly pressured institutions, being wrong is dangerous. Every prognosis is also a resource decision. When a patient is classified as expectant, supplies are redirected, attention shifts, and emotional investment is withdrawn. Reversing that decision requires more than medical evidence. It requires political courage inside the organization. The supervisor's marginal note, review indicated, may appear small. It wasn't. It was an interruption of momentum, a signal that someone was willing to question the flow. But notice how cautious the system remained. The doctor wrote possible reclassification, not reclassify. A form was started, not approved. Language softened reality. Hesitation became policy. This reflects a deeper institutional instinct. Large systems rarely reverse themselves quickly. They move through layers of verification, approval, and documentation. Each layer protects against error. Each layer also delays truth. Meanwhile, sector-wide scrutiny intensified. Reviews of duty rosters and sanitation logs were not just about compliance. They were about control. When improvement appears without authorization, institutions suspect rule-breaking before they suspect misjudgment. It is safer to search for violations than to admit miscalculation. That is why Anna's presence was quietly noted. Not because evidence existed, because uncertainty needs a potential explanation. Someone had to be visible. This is where moral pressure peaks. If the soldier is improving, someone deserves credit. But if that credit comes from outside the authorized structure, the structure is threatened. So doubt is contained. Reassessment is postponed. Risk is managed. Not as revelation, as paperwork, as margin notes, as tentative language, as unsigned forms. Recovery does not announce itself. It negotiates. It works its way through bureaucracy, slowly, reluctantly. This midpoint is not triumph. It is permission. Permission to reconsider. Permission to reopen a closed future. Permission to imagine survival again. And once that permission exists, the system can no longer pretend nothing is happening. From here on, neutrality is impossible. Someone will have to choose between protecting procedure and protecting a life. By late March 1945, the hospital was no longer deciding whether the soldier was alive. That question had been answered. It was deciding whether he was worth saving. That distinction is uncomfortable, but it is exactly how triage systems function under extreme scarcity. Reclassification procedures were designed to be slow and cautious. On paper, this protected against emotional decision-making. In reality, it protected the institution from responsibility. Every delayed signature shifted accountability forward. No one said no. No one said yes. The system said later. Meanwhile, medical evidence continued to accumulate. Normalized vitals, healing tissue, mental clarity. The body was sending consistent signals. Yet approval still required justification that saving him would not harm others. That is the moral arithmetic of war medicine. One life weighed against many. Not abstractly. In inventory counts, in dosage schedules, in evacuation plans. Approving reclassification meant removing resources from someone else whose face the doctors might see tomorrow. Denying it meant accepting a preventable death today. There was no clean outcome. That is why the senior officer wrote borderline. It was not medical uncertainty. It was moral uncertainty. It acknowledged improvement while refusing ownership of the consequence. Deferral became a shield. The note about the soldier wanting to return to his unit is critical. It shows that he had crossed an invisible line. He no longer saw himself as a patient. He saw himself as a soldier again. Identity had returned before permission did. But institutional systems do not recognize identity. They recognize categories: expectant, salvageable, priority, non-priority. Until a file moves categories, the person inside it does not exist differently. Anna's presence in this section matters too. She witnessed the dilemma without any right to influence it. She saw recovery delayed by caution, hope stalled by procedure. For her, silence was not neutrality. It was survival. They translate it into paperwork. They stretch it across committees. They hide it inside phrases like pending further observation. No one appears cruel. No one appears heroic. And yet someone may die. This is the danger of bureaucratic ethics. When responsibility is shared by everyone, it belongs to no one. What happens next will determine whether this system chooses efficiency or courage. March 27, 1945 is not important because medicine suddenly improved. It is important because authority finally moved. For nearly a week, the soldier's body had been signaling recovery. Nurses saw it. Orderlies noticed it. Doctors recorded it. The evidence existed. What was missing was permission. Not diagnosis. Not skill. Approval. Every chart reviewed that morning represented days of hesitation. Not because staff were indifferent, but because the system required proof that survival was worth the resources. The file had to be complete. The supply margin had to exist. The risk had to be low enough. Only then could compassion become policy. Notice what finally made the difference. Not hope, not intuition, not moral appeal. Inventory. When the supply officer confirmed that one more patient could be supported without disrupting surgical priorities, the door opened. Life was authorized by logistics. That is not cruelty. It is institutional reality. Under wartime conditions, medicine becomes a branch of operations. Every dose is a strategic asset. Every patient is a calculation. The senior officer did not choose to save the soldier. He chose that the system could afford to try. Crossing out expectant and writing delayed looks small. It is enormous. It reverses abandonment. It restores legitimacy to a life that had been administratively surrendered. But notice how provisional the decision remained. Delayed. Not safe. Not recovered. Still conditional. Still monitored. Still reversible. Even at the climax, certainty is withheld. Anna's quiet presence matters here. She had watched improvement long before approval arrived. She had witnessed life wait for authorization. Her role shows how proximity to truth does not guarantee influence. Institutions listen to rank, not observation. Medical reality had to align with supply chains, reporting structures, risk management, command priorities. Only when those systems aligned could treatment resume. This is the hidden anatomy of institutional mercy. It is not spontaneous. It is negotiated, and it always arrives late. The climax is not the injection. It is the signature that made the injection possible. And once that signature existed, the system could finally say, this life is worth the investment. What follows will show the cost of waiting so long. The soldier did not win. He endured. What followed reclassification was not relief, but obligation. Weeks of care, monitoring, rehabilitation, and administrative management. From the system's perspective, saving him triggered a cascade of costs. Medicine had to be reserved, a bed had to remain occupied, staff time had to be extended. Every one of those decisions affected other patients. In a high-casualty environment, recovery is not just personal. It is political. Bed capacity was a strategic asset. Evacuation schedules were operational tools. Transfer lists were mechanisms for redistributing survival. Once the soldier stabilized, he was placed on a transport list, not because he was healed, but because the system needed his space. Care was never purely about health. It was about flow. This is the moral tension that continues after the climax. Approving treatment was only the beginning. Now the institution had to justify continuing to invest in him. And that investment came at the cost of exhaustion. Memoirs describing nurses sleeping between rounds and doctors skipping meals are not incidental details. They reveal the human price of delayed decisions. If intervention had happened earlier, recovery might have been shorter. Instead, hesitation extended suffering for the patient and for staff. Delay does not save resources, it shifts them. From medicine to labor, from supplies to burnout, from early treatment to prolonged rehabilitation. Anna's disappearance from the records is also significant. She leaves without recognition, without explanation, without trace. Her role in the story was never officially acknowledged. The system absorbed her labor and erased her presence. That too is a cost. Not recorded in budgets, not listed in reports, but real. This section forces a broader question. Was the system efficient? On paper, yes. Was it humane? Only eventually. Survival arrived late, expensive, and fragile. It depended on exhausted people continuing to care long after the institution had nearly given up. And that, behind every stable for evacuation form, lies a story of people who paid the price so that one person could walk away alive. What remains is not triumph. It is accountability. And the question of whether the system learned anything from the cost. The soldier survived. That is the outcome the system records. Transfer completed, recovery underway, case closed. From an administrative perspective, the story ends there. But that ending hides everything that made survival uncertain. The hesitation, the delay, the moral conflict, the risk taken. None of that appears in evacuation summaries or post-war reports. It disappears into statistics. This is how large systems protect themselves. They preserve results. They erase struggle. Wartime medicine had no space for narrative. It was built for throughput. Patients move through categories the way supplies move through depots. Expectant, delayed, evacuated, discharged. Once a file advanced, the institution considered its job complete. Whether that advance had been resisted for days no longer mattered. Anna's disappearance from the records is the clearest example of this erasure. She played a role in sustaining care when authority hesitated. But her contribution did not fit any reporting category. So it vanished. Not out of malice, out of structure. Institutions reward what they can measure. They forget what they cannot. The post-war reforms tell the same story. Medical manuals were revised, training materials were updated. Language about continuous reassessment was added. The system learned, but it learned abstractly. It did not honor individual moments of courage or hesitation. It turned experience into policy. That is progress, and it is also loss. Because policy remembers patterns, not people. Was this story exceptional, or was it ordinary? The records suggest it was ordinary. One file among thousands, which means the moral dilemma it contained was repeated again and again across wartime medicine. Lives balanced against logistics. Compassion filtered through approval chains. Truth delayed by procedure. This is not a story about one soldier and one nurse. It is a story about how modern systems decide who gets time, who gets resources, who gets reconsidered, and who does not. The soldier lived because, at one moment, enough people were willing to push against inertia. Anna acted without recognition. Nurses documented without authority. Doctors hesitated, then decided. Administrators allowed risk. Alignment happened, briefly. That alignment is rare, and it is fragile. The legacy of this story is not inspiration. It is warning. It reminds us that survival in complex systems is never guaranteed by merit alone. It depends on timing, on courage, on paperwork, on chance, and on whether someone, somewhere, is willing to question what has already been decided. That is the real inheritance of this case. Not that a man lived, but that he almost didn't, because a system nearly decided he wasn't worth the delay.